Rappin' with ReefBum is sponsored by Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine.
Hey, what's happening, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Rappin' with ReefBum. I'm your host, Keith Berkelhamer. So today I have the pleasure of welcoming Gene Diveglia. I'm all messed up here because my keyboard is sticking. I can't type, and now I erased a whole bunch of stuff in my my little script here to read. So I'm all screwed up tonight. Apologize for that. But so Gene is here with us from Reef Labs. Gene, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So, all right. So, background on Gene. Gene is the co-owner of Reef Labs, Inc., a Tampa, Florida-based water analysis laboratory that performs analytical testing, including ICP water tests for saltwater tanks and aquaculture systems. Gene is passionate about everything related with science and technology, and you can see his signature in every aspect of Reef Labs, Inc. The ICP lab aims to provide its customers with exceptional results and proven successful practices. But before we start chatting with Gene, I want to thank the sponsors for this show, Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine. I really appreciate these companies supporting the live stream, and I also appreciate all you folks tuning in out there. Please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, all that jazz. And as always, I always encourage you folks to drop some questions and comments in the chat. I see there's a whole bunch of folks tuning in. So, Gene, man, tell us a little bit about your background. You know, how long have you been in the reef tank and aquaculture world? What's your journey been like?
Sure. Well, when I was growing up, when I was a kid, I had freshwater tanks. Actually, my parents, when they first married, I don't know how they got into it. I don't remember the story anymore, but they used to actually raise freshwater angelfish, and they'd sell them to local fish stores and whatnot. So when I got old enough to take care of a tank, they got me interested in the hobby through that, and I had freshwater tanks most of my pre-college years. And then after I got out of college, it wasn't too long after that. I guess it would have been in the mid '90s. I had my first saltwater reef tank. Quite a bit different than they are now, but it was funny. I found some pictures just a few weekends ago I didn't even know I had, and it was interesting to compare what the hobby was like then versus what it is now.
Oh, it's changed a lot, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has, and I've been in and out of it since then, as time and whatnot permitted. But I got interested in it a few years ago, kind of in an intense way, and that's ultimately what what led to Reef Labs. We have a lot more to work with now, and you have a lot more available in terms of variety of livestock and corals and whatnot. And with that comes all the challenges. And so that's it was through experience and pain really that we got to founding Reef Labs and providing that service to the hobby.
So how long has Reef Labs been around?
So Reef Labs, as a concept, probably about a little over 3 years, 3.5 years, we started to talk about it. And as I mentioned, it was really in response to some of the challenges that I ran into. My brother-in-law also is very avid in the hobby, and we used to get together and talk a lot and share our frustrations and our pains. And he had a buddy who also was, involved in it. And as we started to try to solve those issues, we realized that we didn't really have what we considered to be an adequate tool to address some of the issues that we were encountering. And through trial and error, we all discovered the importance of trace elements and how difficult it was to kind of get a handle on that. And that led to that concept 3.5 years turning into a reality about 2 years ago. And we spent a year in R&D. So I don't want to jump the gun if you have other questions, but ICP is ICP OES is a very broad piece of equipment. It can be used in a lot of industries. There are thousands of parameters that way you can construct a measurement method, and we wanted to make sure that we really optimized the instrument to the task at hand. And it took a year to do that of fairly intensive work. With Chris Meckley at ACI, and also with Chris Wood at Captivate, they were integral partners in developing a successful method for doing the testing. So that's kind of the, in a nutshell, history.
Can you talk more about that partnership in terms of with ACI and Captivate Aquaculture with Chris Wood? I mean, I've had both of those fellows on, Chris a few times, Meckley, and yeah, I mean that's kind of like how you guys got on my radar is through Meckley, because he uses you guys, you know, exclusively, and I know you work with Chris Wood. So can you kind of like talk a little bit about how you guys all kind of ended up putting your you know, kind of all the eggs in the basket there, and you know, had this partnership?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, you know, my brother-in-law we really talked about this for a while, and we had a pretty well-defined plan of what we thought we would do if we were going to launch this. And I started after I met Chris Meckley. You know, we got to talking about different topics, different frustrations, different challenges, and you know, finally we gotten to the you know, my brother-in-law Nathan and I had gotten to the point of frustration where we decided that we were we were ready to pull the trigger on this. And I told Chris one day, I said, you know, I said I'm going to get an ICP-OES and I'm going to, you know, solve these problems. And yeah, he kind of looked at me funny, and he didn't say much. And
Chris didn't say much. That's rare.
Well, I think he didn't believe.
I know he's watching right now, so no pun intended.
He thought, oh, this guy he's got to be full of it, you know. You know? And I told him, I said, yeah, I said probably around, you know, November, December, and I think this was in October maybe that he and I had this conversation. You know, so December rolls around, and I said, hey, Chris, I said, the machine's in the lab, and you know, we're gonna start working on it. And I think it was at that point that he realized that I was serious, and he got intensely interested. I mean, I think he was at one point probably more excited about it than I was, you know, because Chris he's ruthlessly you know, pragmatic about the way he takes care of his coral and his systems, and he approaches it very scientifically and very measured, and you know, he's very careful to observe what he's doing and you know, adjust according to his observations. So this was exciting to him because you know, we were, you know, 40 minutes from him, and I could go and pick up a sample there, and he could have results a few hours later. And you know, so we went through many months of testing his systems weekly, and you know, observing where things didn't make sense, or observing where we weren't getting the accuracy or precision and results that we were interested in getting. A lot of that had to do with variety of systems. You know, ICP OES is subject to interferences from different concentrations of elements. And when you know, take water from different systems, diverse systems, sometimes you run into issues due to those interferences. So using his systems really helped us build a robust method that was resilient to those types of interferences that you might run into from sampling a lot of different sources. And he then introduced me to Chris Wood. And you know, at that time, ACI was using some ideas from Chris Wood and some formulations and whatnot. And so this was an opportunity to kind of work with Chris Wood and learn what he was doing. And we gained a lot of insight into what he thought was important from a biological standpoint, you know, in terms of what trace elements and their effects and whatnot. And of course, we were also able to more closely observe what those additives were doing in ACI systems by having these really instant feedback to what was actually happening with the concentrations of those elements as they were being added into ACI systems. And that was invaluable as well too. So really, it was I think we all benefited and still benefit from that collaboration, and we're still actively you know, using the benefits of collaborating and using each other's resources to continue to develop all of our products better. And it's been very successful.
So just a couple of things. Funny thing here is I think I mentioned at the beginning I'm having problems with my keyboard. It looks like I cannot type an A. So I'm going to be a little challenged in terms of my chat ability tonight, in terms of typing in comments and all that stuff. But yeah, so Quick thing, Gene, in terms of before we dive even deeper into this stuff, for those folks not in the know, can you explain them what ICP stands for, and also explain the difference between ICP OES and ICP MS?
Sure. So ICP literally stands for inductively coupled plasma. And that's quite a concept, actually. And, to maybe break it down into something that's a little more bite-sized, if you're going to analyze things elementally, right? And when I say elementally, I'm differentiating that versus looking at things that are molecules, right? So elements are single atoms, one type. A molecule, of course, is something like phosphate or nitrate, where you've got multiple elements that are bonded in some way. So if you're going to look at things elementally, that's always going to involve some energy to break the bonds, because most elements want to form some form of bond with whatever happens to be present. So in water, you've got metals, and you've got sodium chloride in there, and we talk about them as if they were independent, but they're not actually. They're ions, meaning that they carry some form of electrostatic charge, for being a little oversimplified, but so they're forming complexes, and they're not attached. They're not freely floating in solution. They're actually forming loose bonds with other ions in the water. So in order to break those bonds, you have to use a lot of energy, a lot of heat. So ICP stands for inductively coupled plasma, because it's a means of coupling energy into a plasma to produce a lot of heat. So it's around 6,000, 6,500 degrees is the temperature of the plasma. And that's that plasma you inject a atomized form of your water sample into that plasma, where it then breaks apart the constituents of your sample into individual ions that we can then analyze. The OES part stands for optical emission spectroscopy. And what that tells us, so spectroscopy in general is a word in the scientific community that refers to being able to differentiate something via a spectrum, right? So it could be differences in mass, it could be differences in energy, and it could be difference in frequencies of light or frequencies of radio waves. All of those are forms of spectroscopy. What we're doing is we're looking at the light that those ions emit when they're settling back, when they're cooling off, right, from the plasma. So the plasma heats them up, adds energy, and then at some point they have to relax back down into the cooled state. And when they do that, they release some of that energy in the form of light. And the frequency of that light is unique to each element. So that light passes into the spectrometer, and then we're able to then see a full spectrum of all of those wavelengths of light that are emitted by the sample. And we're also able to measure the amplitudes of each one of those individual wavelengths very precisely. And that's what allows us then to determine what's in the sample and approximately what amount of it. So ICP-MS is a similar thing, but it uses mass instead of light. And actually, to be entirely correct, it uses the ratio of the mass to the charge of the ion. And that's important in this particular way of measuring the elements. But the big idea is that it uses mass instead of light, without getting into the minutia.
So do you guys do a lot of that sort of testing, or is it pretty much the OES is what you're doing for hobbyists?
So the OES is currently what we have available for hobbyists. We're evaluating the benefit and the applicability of using MS in the field. MS is a more accurate method. So OES can reach down into the parts per billion, but when you start to get into the low parts per billion, it's you encounter difficulties, and the measurements aren't as precise. MS can get into parts per trillion and actually below parts per trillion in certain use cases. So it's considerably more accurate in that sense. But the question is that we're trying to answer is how valuable is that to our community, right? And is it worth the additional cost? So there's a question there, that we haven't answered for ourselves yet, and we're still, we're still studying that and trying to determine what the benefit would be. And with all of these products like this, I could construct an ICP OES test for saltwater that costs $500 to do per test, right? It would be extremely accurate, but that's out of the reach of what most people in the hobby would be willing to spend. So, like all things, you have to balance, the cost of providing the service versus the benefit that it provides, and it has to be there has to be a proposition there that makes sense to a hobbyist. So when we look at these products, that's what we're looking at, is how much can we invest into the cost of performing the test and still keep the product affordable, for hobbyists to use it. And we also have other types of equipment in the lab too. We have something that's called a LC-MSMS, which is used for molecular analysis. So that kind of goes above the elemental side, and you can actually look at things like nitrates and phosphates. You can look at amino acids. You can look at proteins. You can look at contaminants, chemicals, toxins, pesticides, all those types of things. But there again, it's a question of, can we bring something to market that makes sense for a hobbyist, and it's at the right price point.
All right, a couple of questions. One, is anybody else doing the MS at this point in terms of that measurement? Other companies that are offering ICP testing?
Yes, I believe there's at least one. There might be two. I think there's one U.S.-based company, and I believe there's maybe one in Europe that's doing it currently that I'm aware of. There may be others. Those are just the ones that I'm aware of.
So is it a matter of like having a lower standard air with a MS test versus an OES test? Is that what it kind of comes down to? It's going to be more reliable in terms of the results, or more precision?
So an MS is generally more precise when you get into those trace elements, right? And you're talking about the macros and the minors. There's probably not too much of a difference from a practical standpoint. And when I say practical standpoint, I mean as far as what a decision that a hobbyist is going to make, or even an aquaculture facility or somebody in the professional field is going to make, is probably not going to be influenced very much by the difference in precision between OES and MS when you're talking about minors, and certainly not with macros. So that's part of our internal debate as to where the value point is with those. So really, you're looking at the trace elements, right? And there again, you have to ask that question: is the improvement in accuracy is it really going to change the decision that a hobbyist or a professional user of the test might make?
Right.
Evaluating the data, and that's not clear. We're still trying to compile some research on that, and part of that involves understanding what some of those limits and effects are of some of those trace elements that I'm sure we're probably going to talk about in some minutes.
Oh, for sure. So Gene, what were some of the big reasons why you guys started this service? What was missing from the other services out there that offer ICP testing that you thought that you could kind of fill the gap? I know you were talking about working with Meckley and Chris Wood, but what were some of the big reasons? What were some of the things that you guys had seen with current ICP testing services that didn't seem to really have everything that you guys thought they should have?
Sure. I think the main issue was that, all of us in my group, my brother-in-law and I and some of our friends were all experiencing a common or similar set of problems, right? And I started using ICP analysis in general. I'm not referring to a specific vendor, but I started doing ICP analysis on my water samples as a means to try and understand what was happening, right? Because clearly there were changes happening in our tanks that we couldn't correlate to any of the things that we could measure with consumer kits. And, the scientific background, that bothered me, at the core, right? So I wanted to find out why. And, we started to explore what some of the available kits were that were out there. And I think I tried all of the ones that were accessible at the time. And I just found that the results that I was getting were not enough for me to be able to identify the problems and bring about stability.
You're talking about other ICP tests?
Correct. Okay. And, and again, and I don't, I want to be clear here, because I don't, I'm not interested in bashing anybody. Everybody has their businesses.
We could leave the names out.
Right, we'll leave the names out. But also, I mean, just from a being impartial about this, like I said, you can do a real cheap, quick test with ICP OES just like you can with anything else, but you're gonna have to pay for that in some way in terms of a lack of accuracy or inconsistency. The more time and resources you put into sample prep and how the machine is configured and how you maintain the machine and the standards that you use, the gases and all the things that go into it, the more money you put into that, the better results you're going to get with that equipment. And of course, that cost has to be covered by your business model as well too. So we just found that for what we were interested in doing, we couldn't achieve that with the trade-offs that were being made with the existing kits on the market. So that's what prompted us really to do this, because we couldn't find a solution, and we knew there was one. I mean, I didn't have any doubt in that. It was just a matter of getting the right data and getting the right metrics to be able to solve these problems.
So a couple of questions from the viewers here. From Peter T. Does Gene have any distributions in Canada? Should we recommend to local fish stores to get in contact? Is that possible in Canada, Gene?
We are looking into it. We've had several requests, and absolutely, if someone is interested, we'd love to hear from them, and that just helps us gauge the amount of interest and incentivizes us even more to find a solution for it. So yeah, absolutely. If anybody's interested, please reach out to us. We're happy to get the details and try to find out a way that we can do something for them.
Uptown Reef Keeper had a question about the turnaround time, and I saw that Chris responded that it's anywhere between 1 to 6 days. What can one expect, Gene, in terms of, does it depend closer you are to Florida, the quicker turnaround time you're going to get?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we use USPS for deliveries for a number of reasons. It provides a pretty affordable option for hobbyists in terms of shipping. We include the cost of return shipping with our kits, and we also want it to be easy. Sometimes it's not convenient to go to UPS or somewhere to FedEx or drop off a package. It's nice just to be able to have your mail carrier pick it up. So all around, that turned out to be a pretty balanced solution for most people, and it also gives us the ability. We have some visibility in the tracking of the kits, so we use all first-class postage for the return kits, and we include tracking on all those, and we share that tracking information actually with customer too. After they register their kit, they can see it move through the postal system, so that they know when it's actually in our hands. So we can't control that. Obviously, what USPS does. Most of the time, they're pretty good. But being honest, occasionally things happen, right?
Oh yeah, well, you and I were talking before the show. My local post office lost one of its regulars, and so now I've had some packages sitting there for about 10 days, and I went down yesterday to pick them up. Like, sorry, we can't give you your packages because we don't know where they are. They're in a huge pile. We've got somebody coming in from like New Hampshire to help sort this stuff out. So hopefully you'll get your packages by Friday. So yeah, well, I'm glad that you're not sending me stuff other than the kit. So I might have to hold off on ordering a couple of those from. Well, actually, I've got a whole stash from Meckley. I ordered a bunch of tests from Meckley, so I think I'm good until my postal service issues are solved. Oh, thank you very much. I'm going to hack up this name here, but. Navra Hashal Shirike, thank you very much for that super chat. Have a tough name, you can call it Nav. Love your show. Thanks, Nav. Really appreciate that. So, can a sample degrade over time? Like if it's in transit for a long time, can that potentially impact the results?
So if you were measuring something like alkalinity or nitrates or phosphates, yes, that can change. But because we're looking at the elemental composition, it doesn't really matter if the forms of those elements change because of microbial activity or anything like that in the sample. We're going to break them down into the raw elements anyway. We use tubes that are specially designed not to absorb elements out of the samples in the water. Adds a little bit of expense, but it obviously results in a better product. So in all intents and purposes, no. It would potentially maybe when you're talking about a year or more, there could be some small changes in the sample, but that's certainly well beyond anything that anybody would experience.
So how you test 35 plus elements? Is that and
That's correct.
No alkalinity, no nitrate.
Correct. Yeah. And the reason
go ahead.
The reason for those is really, again, you can experience changes in those. Nitrate and phosphate can shift due to microbial activity. Not much, but they can. Alkalinity is very difficult to measure out of source. There are a lot of factors, including air gap in the tube and gases that are trapped in the sample that may release in shipment. Alkalinity is very difficult to correctly contain a sample and measure it, in a laboratory. So it's almost always going to be wrong by a certain amount. So something maybe at some point we'll look at, but there's a plethora of consumer grade kits that are more than accurate enough for people to know those.
Yeah, that's what the alkalinity monitors are for, right? So you can have as many tests as you want throughout the day, which
exactly.
Which is nice for certain folks that like to do a lot of testing. So all right, Bert Minshew has a good question here. Continue on talking about elements. What can you expect with a Reef Lab test of phosphate versus a HANA checker? Do you average seeing higher or lower than the HANA checker? Any you guys have any visibility, Gene, into how your phosphate numbers stack up versus hobby grade test kits?
Sure. This is a common question. So what we measure with ICP-OES is phosphorus content, because phosphorus is the element, right, that's involved here. And phosphorus is, a vital element within any biological ecosystem, and it's not always active only in the form of phosphate. There are other phosphorus containing molecules and enzymes and even other forms, similar forms to phosphate, like phosphonates, that are active and important in biological systems. So, this is a kind of fuzzy, rough area to discuss anyway, as far as a closed, aquaculture system. So phosphates are good, rule of thumb, I guess, to use, because they are probably the most common stable form of phosphorus that you're going to find in an aquarium or in an aquaculture system. So they're a good reference point to use. We provide a calculated value for phosphate in our reports, which is based on the phosphorus value that we measure. And this is again, that's an estimate, because you don't know if all the phosphorus really is in the form of phosphate. Most of it probably is. The consumer kits use a variety of different methods to measure phosphate, and none of those are direct. Phosphate is actually a pretty challenging molecule to measure chemically. So a lot of these test kits use some form of secondary measurement. So you're adding, your reagents together, and they're actually transforming that phosphate into another compound, and then they're measuring that compound because it's easier to measure calorimetrically. Is generally what most of the consumer kits use. So it's a little bit indirect. It's one step removed. You're actually measuring the byproduct of a conversion of phosphate into something else. And that's always going to be prone to, a certain amount of error. If you dig really deep in some of the, the manuals and some of the notes that are on the websites, the companies that manufacture these consumer kits, particularly HANA and even some of the professional grade stuff like Kalk, they'll list, and way back in the back of the booklet, they'll tell you all the interferences that can change the readings, and it's generally a long list. And there are things that we find in our tanks. Sometimes it's something as common as magnesium. So if your magnesium level is different, it's gonna change the reading a bit. So the main important thing is consistency. In that case, if you're going to use a consumer kit, go for consistency. At least you can observe your corals and see how they look, and correlate that to a reading that you're getting on your on your consumer device. Or if you're using an ICP test for it, then you can correlate it to that. But as far as comparing them, that's a tall order for phosphate.
It's frustrating with the hobby grade test kits. I think I talked about it on this show maybe a couple of episodes ago, but I was using the Milwaukee test kit for phosphate or phosphorus, whatever the kit is for, and for one of my tanks, I was consistently getting 0.000 on that, and then I sent in a sample to you guys, and it came back, that my phosphate was like over 0.1. So, obviously I was leaning on that number versus the 0.000, But before I sent in the sample to you guys, I did I dosed a lot of phosphate because I thought I had 0 phosphates in my tank, and I don't know if it was a coincidence or not, but I had a couple of corals that just browned out on me. So yeah, it's just kind of it's been a bugaboo of mine like over the years. Well, recently, I never tested for phosphate years ago when I had reef tanks. I just never tested for it. I guess because it was a not an easy test to get or to do, whatever it was years ago. So I never even looked at that number. But so that's kind of a catch-22, right? I mean, we've got all this information these days, and you've got so many numbers to look at. So what do you do with all that information? Do you just micromanage your tank and just really react based on those numbers? So in my case, I reacted too quickly, and I probably should have sat back and waited for the ICP test number.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing too to keep in mind is I think sometimes when we all do it, we forget that we look at it as just a number, and we see that it's not where it should be, and we want to change it, and we don't always take into consideration the impact that has in the in the tank or in an ecosystem. Sometimes it's better to make those changes gradually to give that ecosystem a chance to adapt, because they often have consequences in other areas.
Right.
The trace metals work together, and if you remedy a deficiency in one, you're likely to create a deficiency somewhere else in the process. So that's also an important lesson, is make those changes slowly and deliberately. Target a small number of areas and work on those, and work on them slowly. Give the system a chance to balance, and obviously observe the coral. That's the most important part.
Yes, observe the corals for sure.
Yeah.
Is it feasible to if you're doing what I described in terms of you've got a hobby grade phosphate test kit, you're doing those tests, let's say weekly, and then maybe once a month you're doing an ICP test with you guys, and you're kind of able to compare the results between the ICP test versus the hobby grade test kit, and you see some sort of consistent pattern between the two numbers. Is that feasible to say, like, if the ICP testing numbers are twice as high as the hobby grade test kit numbers that you've been generating, can you kind of like, with some sort of confidence go with all right, maybe it's 2 times higher than, or half of what I'm, or 2 times higher than what I'm seeing?
Sure, I would say yes, but with some caution, right? I would say within a 30% window. And the reason I say that is because phosphate is something that can change quite readily in a system for a variety of reasons. Time of day, if you happen to have a macroalgae in the system that's in a sump that's lighted. Also, I mean, depending on when you feed your fish or what additives you're using, phosphate levels can fluctuate quite a bit. So if you're going to do that, and the same thing is true when you take your samples for the ICP test, try to be very consistent about when you take it, and be observant of, if you've got a regular routine for feeding and additives and all that, then that's great. But if you don't, try to be observant of how closely you might do those things to when you take a water sample, because phosphate can change much more rapidly than many of the other variables that we track.
So, Gene, here's something, man. You'll hit the jackpot if you could invent this. How about a lab grade phosphate monitor that you could use, in your home aquarium, and just being able to like have that ability to instantly measure phosphate with a lab grade? Is that just like an impossibility at this point in time? Is that just not feasible?
I think economically, it's not feasible. Such a thing does exist. There's a company that makes them for environmental purposes. Oftentimes they use them for monitoring runoff waters or estuary waters and things like this. But they're, you're talking $5,000 to $6,000 for an to do that. So it's probably not going to become popular. I
can only think of a handful of people that might have the coin to pony up for that sort of instrument. But yeah, okay. Interesting. So Mike Hoppa's got a question. Reef Labs doesn't test for tin. What effect does tin play on our reefs? A different company a few months ago showed elevated tin. It led to a rusty magnet discovery. Any feedback about tin?
Yeah. So again, this is a choice that we made in terms of what we included in the test based on what we could achieve a certain reliability standard on. Tin happens to be a challenging metal in ICP OES. There are a number of those. So each element has with it its own set of challenges and interferences and problems. Tin and mercury, arsenic. There are a handful of others are very difficult. There are numbers, copper, molybdenum, and boron actually are also somewhat challenging, not as much as those. So, at some point you have to draw a line and say, well, what can we include that fits the envelope of accuracy that we want to have for all of the elements. And tin just wasn't one that made the cut because of what it would have added in terms of cost and time to the kit. So, or to the test process, actually, not to the kit itself, but to the actual process of testing. So that's not to say, and this is actually one of the arguments that is probably for us introducing an ICP-MS test kit, because it would allow us to offer a broader range of elements. It would be somewhere north of 70 elements if we were to do that, and it would include tin. So that's an argument for it, and that's certainly one that we're considering in that case. But as far as the OES test was concerned, we were more interested in ensuring that the elements that we included were accurate and precise than we were necessarily in trying to include every element that we could possibly put in there.
So Cruise Reef Clan is wondering, do you test RO water also? I mean, does that make sense? Would there be a reason to test RO water to see if it's got any contaminants in it?
Sure. So yeah, this is a common question, and we do. Yes, we do test RO water. We don't include that with every kit, and there's reason for that. RO water systems tend to change very slowly, right? You exhaust your membrane and your DI resins and carbon and all those things very slowly compared to the rate at which water can change in an aquarium. So it doesn't make sense to test RO water on the same interval that you would test aquarium water, because you're kind of wasting money and resources to do that. So if you want to test your RO water, you can, instead of sending in a salt sample, you can buy a kit and you can send in an RO sample and we'll test it. But we found that you've got so much weight to work with to keep postage under a certain amount, and we chose to have 2 tubes in the kit that were both saltwater, mainly because, believe it or not, it's rather frequent that one of those tubes gets broken in transit because of a sorting machine chews it up. Sometimes people aren't always careful when they put the caps on, and one of the caps will be on a little bit crooked, and half the liquid runs out in transit. And that can be very frustrating, particularly if you've got an issue that you're trying to solve, and if there was only one tube with salt water in it, and the other one had your RO and your salt water leaked or got broken, and you've got an issue, I mean, that can be disastrous, because it could add a week or 2 weeks of time till you could send in another sample. So we thought that was the best trade-off, to do it that way. But yes, by all means, if somebody wants to test RO, send it in and we'll do it.
But that's what the 2 tubes are for, just in case.
That's right.
One gets busted.
Insurance policy.
So Paulie1291988, is that your social? No, a couple of digits short there. So if you do ICP testing and everything is in line, is it still necessary to do water changes? And I saw Chris answering that question. If everything is in line, no. We are hoping at some point we never do a water change on any of our systems. So what? Yeah, like to get your thoughts in terms of that, in terms of water changes and what you guys do. And there's other companies out there we won't talk about, but they have a whole system in terms of being able to have trace elements and minor and trace elements, and being able to not do water changes based on those test results. Is that what the whole connection, a big part of it is with Captivate Agriculture?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and I agree, it's absolutely possible to not do water changes. I do them very infrequently on my personal tank at home, and I say infrequently, maybe a year and a half since the between water changes. I know Chris Wood has some of his personal tanks that are longer than that, between water changes. The main issue, there's 2 issues. One, you have to decide, as a hobbyist, do you want to do that? Do you enjoy, looking at those numbers and figuring out how to correct those, those deficiencies or correct the excesses? Is it something you're willing to do? Or would you rather do, a comparatively easy thing, and that's just continue, with water changes? So that's part of it. It's a personal decision. What do you enjoy doing? How do you enjoy your reef? Do you want to spend time doing that, or would you, rather do water changes? The other side of it is contaminants. So, all of these salts and metals and things that we add into our systems have to come from a mine somewhere. And the reality is that there's lots of contaminants in those substances that have to be removed to get to the elements and the salts that we're interested in. And there again, it's cost, right? So buying lab chemicals. I mean, there's lots of different grades that you can purchase. For example, we use something that's called trace metal grade in the lab for our analysis, and those are anywhere from 4 to 5 nines pure, and they're very costly to get them that pure. Obviously, we can't use those in the hobby because all the additives would be out of reach for almost everybody. So you have to, again, it's a product decision, and in marketing and how you price things to determine what you want to offer. Captivate offers an exceptional product. Chris Wood goes to great lengths to choose sources for his salts and chemicals that he uses in his compositions to minimize those contaminants as much as possible. And when I say goes to great lengths, he goes to great lengths. I mean, he literally will identify mines in parts of the world that inherently have less contaminants. Lithium is a common one. Cesium is another one that are very common, and that makes a difference, because if you're not doing water changes, anything else that's in your additives besides what you want to be in there is going to accumulate. And some of those are not easy to remove. Some things you can remove with carbon or GFO or resins or things like that. But cesium and lithium are pretty difficult.
Should we be concerned, Gene, if we have high lithium levels in our tanks? I mean, I've always heard that there's a lot of salts that have a lot higher elevated lithium, but I've also read that it's not something that hobbyists should be terribly concerned about.
Yeah, I don't personally have any evidence that it's a problem, and I've seen many, outstanding tanks that have high lithium levels that, certainly aren't showing any signs of distress or other issues. I'm certain that there is probably a limit, with all things. I mean, if you accumulate enough of it, eventually it's going to cause a problem. I don't know what that limit is. I've seen tanks with that look healthy with as much as 2-3 parts per million lithium. But like all things, I mean, the closest you can keep it to natural seawater, if it's an unknown like that, the better off you are. But I certainly wouldn't be concerned if you see lithium levels that are around 1 part per million, give or take. But again, it's an unknown, so there's that caveat with it.
So, how would somebody utilize your service to not do the water changes? What would you recommend in terms of frequency of the ICP tests? How often should they be doing them? What should they be doing in terms of figuring out what elements to be, what traces or elements to be to dosing, to add? How does that all come into play in terms of following that methodology?
Well, I think it depends partially on where you're at as a hobbyist. If you have an established tank and you've got thousands of dollars of coral that you've been collecting and caring for years, I would say do it every month as an insurance policy. I mean, we're talking about approximately $40. I mean, that's pretty little to pay to protect something that you've invested years into and potentially is worth tens of thousands of dollars, right, depending on what you have. I would look at it that way. And the reason I say that is that, people often come up with ways of getting their systems to that point that are based on trial and error. And, there are implicit assumptions with that trial and error that change as the amount of biomass changes in your system. And the likelihood, your biomass is always growing, right? If you're a very regimented and you follow a regular process and procedure, that's not changing. So if your biomass is changing and your process isn't changing, eventually they're going to get to the point where one is not able to support the other. And I think that's why we often see people have these gorgeous tanks. They've had them for 4, 5, 6 years and they crash with no explanation. And I suspect it's just probably that the biomass outgrew the process, right? And some essential element or essential elements eventually weren't being kept up with whatever the process was, and the coral adapted until they couldn't. anymore, and then you have system failure. So in that case, I say do it, do it monthly, ideally, 6 weeks, if you have to. If you're new, right, you're just starting out, then my answer is a little bit different. I would say, think about what your objective is, right? Are you trying to just, make your system sustainable for coral, or are you trying to go for the most growth and the best coloration you can possibly get? If you're trying to make it sustainable, I would say, do something at the beginning, let your tank equalize for a bit, maybe a couple months later, 3 months later, do it again, and, ease into it. If you're going for growth and coloration and you're really into it, and you've got the wherewithal and the right head to be able to work with those numbers, then I would say identify a few elements that are important and work on those. Get those stable. Test as regularly as you can, right, till you get those stable. Once you've got those solved, go after another group. And do that until you've achieved whatever your goal might be. If you've got the coloration and growth that you want, then level off there and kind of keep it going. But use it as a tool, and do like you would with any tool. Think carefully about how you're using it to make sure that it aligns with what your goal is.
Yeah, so since I started using your ICP test, I've been working with with Chris Wood at Captivate, and also Chris Meckley has been guiding me as well in terms of utilizing the Reef Labs ICP testing and traces and what have you. So yeah, basically what I've been doing is I've been running some ICP tests with you guys, and then Chris Wood has been recommending certain traces that I should be dosing, in my 2 different systems. So it's a matter of looking at the data from you and then kind of consulting with Chris, and he's got a spreadsheet that I utilize that basically just kind of punch your results into that spreadsheet, and it kind of, I guess, generates these recommendations in terms of how much you should be dosing. Is that something that potentially you might have might automate? Maybe you have that sort of calculator on your website, make it more I guess easier to kind of like digest that data and then pop in some numbers and generate some recommendations that way.
Yeah, and I would say 2 things. I mean, we've made some recent enhancements in the last few weeks to kind of help people make better use of those numbers. We've given some indicators about things that are changing, or things that are changing rapidly, or decreasing rapidly. We're also showing you comparisons against your previous tests, so you can see easily how much something moved. So the whole site is geared around trying to give you the information that you need to make use of those numbers, instead of just kind of throwing them out there. So we put a lot of thought into the website and the way the numbers are presented, and we have plans to continue to do that. We're going to continue to enhance that. A lot of it is coming from feedback from our customers and feedback from Chris and both Chris's. So that's part of it. The other part of it, though, is Chris Meckley and Chris Wood. They're both superstars. I mean, in the hobby. I mean, they've both forgotten more than most of us know about taking care of coral. I mean, the number of years of experience there between the 2 of them is incredible. And they're both like-minded. They're both passionate. We also need to have people like both of them in the industry sharing that knowledge, as they both are. That's equally important. No matter what we do to provide numbers and results and all this, it's not we'll never overtake the value of also having that wisdom and experience available too. And I think they're both looking at ways also to try and improve how they're transferring their knowledge and experience into the hobby as well too. But you also need to have a reliable way to measure those things to go with that advice. So it works hand in hand.
Yep. No, I mean, it would be awesome to have that sort of integration with your data and with Captivate or whoever, whatever traces folks would use out there, some sort of easier way to kind of like figure out if you want to follow that certain method in terms of reading the data, understanding the data, and how to act on that data.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any best practices for collecting sample water? Is there a certain area of the tank or the system that you should be collecting sample water, a day versus night? right after feeding the fish. Is that okay? I know after feeding the fish, I try not to do like a phosphate test because I think that's going to be an elevated number there. But any tips in terms of collection?
I would say if you're doing dosing at a particular time of the day of traces, wait a few hours. Ideally 2 or 3 hours before you take with feeding. Let some hours pass after feeding before you take samples. Otherwise, obviously, I think this probably goes without saying, make sure your hands are clean. You haven't touched any, containers that have trace elements or touched any foods, frozen foods or anything like that. Try to actually submerge the tube under the surface, kind of upside down. So you trap the air in there and let the air out so that you're getting water out of the column and not surface water. Surface water is more likely to have dust and other contaminants, or even things, that you maybe get a biofilm there that can make those measurements not quite as accurate. Make sure you rinse out the tubes 2 or 3 times of the tank water as well too. That way, if there is, like I said, we use a high quality tube, but it never hurts to make sure that it's rinsed out. And then also, absolutely make sure you fill the tube to the top when you cap it, for several reasons. One, it's just better not to have any air there. And two, we use 14 mLs of water in the test, and our system is calibrated against 14 mLs. Sometimes people don't quite fill it to 14, and that's actually another reason for the second tube is we have to use the other tube to get a full 14 mLs. Because it makes things, it affects the accuracy of the test. We can adjust for it. If somebody sends in a kit, and we've had it happen before where one tube is half empty and the other one's completely empty, we can still do the test, but it requires an adjustment, and it does reduce the accuracy of the test to test with a lower volume of water.
Mr. Reef Safe, thank you very much for that super chat. The comment is, "Hey Gene," so I guess you know Mr. Reef Safe.
I do. Another awesome member of our community there. So.
Have you guys ever thought about testing for bacteria? There's one service out there that does that, Aquabiomics. They test for bacteria. It kind of it reminded me because when you mentioned people have beautiful reef tanks and after 4 or 5 years all of a sudden they crash. A lot of that can be bacteria related in terms of the RTN or the STN or whatever else might cause a crash. Have you guys thought about looking into that in terms of testing for bacteria?
So at this point, I'm not interested in doing it. We're not. Eli does a fantastic job. He, I believe, based on my limited conversations with him and observing the kit, I actually use their kits. It does an exceptional job of monitoring detail and quality in the product. So there's an adequate solution there in the market, and I think it's fair priced. So there's not much of a business reason to challenge it. But I definitely recommend it. You can actually, as you correct trace elements, you can visibly see your bacterial colony change. Trace elements have a huge impact on bacteria in closed systems, and I think is actually, and there's a growing body of evidence, open ocean research mostly, that shows that there's quite a bit more connection between those trace elements and the bacteria, and also between the bacteria and the coral as well too. That there's quite a bit more connection there, appears, than we're aware of. And we're always, as a matter of fact, selenium just kind of popped up on the radar this week. There had been a lot of debate as to the importance of selenium in microbial activity until recently. They actually identified multiple other pathways in which bacteria can utilize selenium in fairly important ways. So those things are always, it's a growing field, and we're learning a lot. So I think we're going to find in the coming years that there's even greater importance than what we currently realize in balancing trace elements.
Yeah, no, the microbiome is just so important, but there are a lot of unknowns. I've done some of the bacteria testing myself, and it's good to kind of see what the diversity is of the bacteria and whether or not you have any bacteria that you need to be concerned about. But yeah, that's interesting to know in terms of how the the relationship to traces. I did not realize that.
Yep, absolutely.
What about, and folks, let me remind you, if you want to ask Gene a question, feel free to drop the question into the chat. What about benchmark data, Gene? How do you guys compile your benchmark data? Because in your reports, you have a you have the numbers that are being tested for the particular aquarium, and then you're comparing them to these norms, these benchmark data. And yeah, talk to us about that.
That came from a massive amount of research. So it turns out there's not the agreement on a lot of these values, particularly when you're talking about the trace elements. Macros and minors, I think there's a fairly good consensus if you look in published research papers. So we actually went to the journals, scientific journals in the field of marine biology, and looked at what were people doing, what had they studied, what were the results, what was published, how were they measuring these. And we found an actually incredible amount of diversity in the measured results. And of course, there's also some variation depending on where those samples are taken. There are certain parts of the world in particular that have some deviations there. So we try to take all of that into account. In addition to that, part of that year long of R&D was, and it's still ongoing actually, that activity is still ongoing, was observing how we can push these limits and what limits we actually see in healthy systems. So we've done some of our own research in that area. We'll take an individual element and push it far beyond what anybody would consider safe or even think about doing with a reef tank, and observe what happens. One of those is potassium, and certainly there's some benefits there in using some potassium compounds for managing pH and otherwise, but we found that we could actually elevate potassium by almost 3 times what's in natural seawater without observing much of an effect. Now, when we get to 3 times, there are certain species of coral, and also it's a little hard on the fish, and you can observe effects. So we found that a lot of elements have quite a bit of leeway in them. Others do not. So it's a combination of that research, our experience, and also what we see in the test results that are coming in, and where we actually have access to those systems or can assess the health of those systems in some way. And we expect to improve those over time as well, as we have more data and more information to use to compound those. But that said, our ranges are conservative. Maybe not as conservative as every benchmark that's out there, but we did err on the side of being conservative to ensure that we're not going to steer anybody into an area where they might have problems. Another factor to consider is that many of these elements don't act independently. Many of them act in concert, so you also have to be careful in considering that if one is out of range, it can impact the effect of others. So those ranges, our benchmark ranges, were designed to mitigate that, so that if you did have imbalances in one area, it wouldn't suddenly cause a slight excess in another area to become detrimental to the health of the system.
How much weight do you put in terms of natural seawater parameters in your benchmarks? You hear a lot of people say when they're talking about their tanks, in terms of where their nitrates and their phosphates and their alk and calcium and magnesium. And, well, I stick to natural seawater parameters. So how much weight do you guys put into natural seawater?
So natural seawater is certainly probably the most conservative that you can get in terms of choosing ranges, but that comes with with a liability. And natural seawater barely changes, right? The open ocean has such a capacity to buffer the ranges of those elements that very few naturally occurring events can alter them significantly in a short period of time. And that stability, is predominantly what allows natural seawater to be so successful with marine life. But you also have to consider that natural marine life is in the open ocean is basically restricted by iron. Iron is mostly responsible for putting a limitation on how quickly things can grow and how well things survive in the ocean. So when you try to transfer that into a closed system, it's difficult, because in a closed system you can have very rapid fluctuations. So the relative ratios of those elements don't stay very constant in a closed system. So if you've got life that's barely on the edge of something that's stable, and then you add fluctuation into it, it's probably not a very good mix. It's a hard condition to maintain. So we tend to err on the side of certain elements having a little bit more than what's in the open ocean, because they're stabilizing elements that you don't really want to fluctuate because of their impact on marine metabolism of the organisms, or also bacterial health, bacterial populations. So we tend to err on the side of being high on those to try to mitigate the differences of a closed system. You don't have that stability. So natural seawater is conservative, but it also carries with it the peril of, if you can maintain everything perfectly, then you won't have issues with natural seawater levels. But the reality is that's very hard to do. So a lot of our research has been focused on, well, which areas can we supplement without detriment that will add stability to the system and help offset those fluctuations that are inevitable in other elements.
What about customer tanks? Does that factor into the equation at all in terms of benchmark data? Do you utilize customer tanks? If you've got some customers, Chris at ACI that has very successful systems, is that part of the equation at all?
Absolutely, yeah. If we have access or some other suitable substitute to know that the system is healthy and in good condition, absolutely, we factor as much data as we can into those assessments, knowing how important it is to get a as wide a breadth of variety as we possibly can into those assessments.
All right, some questions. Speaking of Chris at ACI, he says, ask Gene about the skimmate test. Is that a loaded question?
So that was actually something we did some months ago in conjunction with Chris at ACI. We were very curious about what actually is coming out of a system in skimmate. I mean, I don't know how broadly known the theory is of skimmers, but bacteria have a small electrical charge. And yes, when you hear about gram negative or gram positive, it refers to whether that bacteria naturally has a negative or positive charge. And anytime you have a interface between water and air, there's also a slight electrical charge there, which is actually what's responsible for creating the surface tension in water. That's why if you drop a plastic bead or styrofoam bead in water, you'll see it kind of indent a little bit, but it won't sink. That's that electrostatic charge on the surface. So in a skimmer, you have a lot of air to water surface contact, and what that actually does is that electrical charge of the surface tension between the air and water attracts the bacteria to it. And so skimmers are very effective at removing bacteria from the water column for that reason, which is why your skimmate is so rich in bacterial content. Obviously, it pulls out proteins and other things too for similar reasons, but the bacterial part was what interested us. We wanted to see, well, okay, we know it's pulling out a lot of bacteria, so it's an ideal opportunity to find out, well, how much of the trace elements that we're putting in these systems are actually ending up in the bacteria versus the coral. And, make a long story short, we found very large concentrations of trace elements in skimmate, which, supported this idea that we had that the bacteria actually were mostly responsible for consuming the trace elements, and then the coral, in turn, are then consuming the bacteria via the mucosa that you find, everybody's familiar with on all coral. And that's actually being initiated by more and more research that's coming out, in the industry, in the journals and whatnot. They're finding that a lot of symbiotic activity happening there, and corals are getting a significant amount of their nutritional requirements by consuming those bacteria.
Do you would you recommend to folks to dose bacteria on a daily or weekly basis, just to help feed those corals and keep the microbiome diverse?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, we use aquabiomics test kits, and there's absolutely a correlation between bacterial diversity and the health of the system. And I think it's a very easy thing to do. I mean, to periodically do it, and I definitely recommend it. Can't go wrong.
So a question from Hamada H, if I pronounce that correctly. Hey, Gene, can you tell us a little bit about your scheduled maintenance on the instruments? How often, how long, and how many people does it take to run the instruments?
Sure. So, any laboratory is going to have scheduled downtime to do maintenance. These instruments are extremely complex. They have, a number of components. I mean, for example, the OES system uses liquid argon and liquid nitrogen. It also uses chilled water. Actually, it's not water, but it's water with a particular additive. There are optical surfaces. There are um, 20 or 30 different surfaces with O-rings that experience wear. There are surfaces that are exposed to the plasma that develop corrosion and have to be cleaned. So it's it's part of the proper maintenance of the systems is to take care of those on a regular basis. We prefer to do it more often than not, but that's something that we anticipate probably doing twice per year. I think once in the fall and once in the spring. And we go to every length possible, obviously, to let people know and well in advance so that people can plan around that in terms of when they send their kits in. But it's part of our strategy to maintain that level of quality and consistency in the tests that we really strive to with our products.
So Dan Savetsky is asking, gonna try this company soon. Really enjoyed these sessions. Thank you, ReefBum. Thanks, Dan. So Gene, where can folks get these test kits?
So we have on our website, you can go there and we've got a buy link up in the top corner, and you go to that buy link, that'll take you to a page with a map that shows all of the retail stores, local fish stores that carry our products, and also our online partners that carry the products as well. So there's lots of options there. We definitely encourage people if their local fish store doesn't carry the product to ask them to reach out to us, and we'll put them in contact with ACI. ACI is actually our sole distributor in the U.S. We made that decision very carefully because number one, we know that Chris is passionate about all aspects of coral care and whatnot, and we also we didn't want to focus on that ourselves because we wanted to put all of our resources into testing, the product development, and how we present the data. And managing fulfillment takes a lot of energy and time. So we thought that was the perfect choice there. And so any of the local fish stores can get in contact with ACI and carry the product, and we'll put them on our website as well too, so that they're available and reachable. But that's the place to go. Go to the buy link, and you put in your zip code or whatnot, see if there's anybody near you, or you can buy them from saltwater.com or also from Aquaholics. And so we try to make them, and that list is growing, almost on a weekly basis. So hopefully we'll get more soon.
So the love is coming back from ACI. Amanda Meckley, thank you so much for the super chat there, Amanda. Gene is such a wealth of information. So happy you had him on, Keith. Thanks to Nathan and Gene for starting up Reef Labs. Great people! ! Mike Hoppa's got a question. Recently started dosing Isolate MT, which is a Captivate aquaculture product. Last ICP test showed deficiencies in many trace elements. How long after initial dosing before taking another ICP test to check results? 10 days / 1 drop beginning dose.
I would say every 2 weeks is a good interval when you're trying to dial in trace elements like that. MT is a fantastic product because it makes it relatively easy when you're trying to satisfy a number of those trace elements that are commonly deficient. 2 weeks is enough time to kind of find out where you're at. The recommendations on those products are intentionally fairly conservative. Chris Wood did a great job of I think providing safe starting points for all of his products so that people don't have unintended accidents with their systems that all of us have experienced one time or another. But by starting out that way and testing regularly, you can build up to optimal levels without risking an overage that could be catastrophic.
What about the use of GFO, right? Granuloferric oxide to remove phosphates is so that stuff not only binds phosphate, but it could also bind valuable trace elements. Do you always say to people, try to stay away from GFO and go more natural means for nutrient reduction, or is GFO okay in small doses?
I would always say try to go the natural means if you can. It's always safer that way. I know that everybody that I personally know that I've talked to has had a variety of experiences with GFO, and it can affect polyp extension. It can affect a lot of things. Coral do respond to it. It's not entirely clear what's driving that. It may be, suspended particulates. It depends on how well you rinse it. There also are a tremendous number of different qualities of GFO out there. GFO gets its properties based on its the structure, the material, and all GFO is not the same, right? So that's certainly a factor in it as well too. It is very effective at removing aluminum, which is a positive, and sometimes arsenic. But it's not entirely clear what else it's removing at the same time. It's a study actually we've been interested in doing to try and ascertain what else it's capable of removing. Iron is a very active element, in terms of binding with other elements. And I know from other studies that we've done in the lab that like for example, if we're analyzing other studies, not seawater, if you've got high levels of iron in those samples, it makes it very difficult to measure other elements in the samples because iron tends to stick to them. So I'd say there's probably a pretty good chance that GFO removes a lot of things that we don't want it to remove, in addition to things that we do in systems.
Yeah, early on in my reef keeping career, I used GFO, to control phosphates, and it was frustrating because sometimes I would, be a little bit too aggressive with it, and I would experience, faded colors on my corals. So I always thought it was it's easy to use, it's very easy to use, but I think it's a, bit of a risk in terms of how much do you use and when to refresh it. So it's yeah, and then the whole thing in terms of removing the valuable trace elements, I think, is certainly a key point. Gene, if you had to rattle off a top 10 list of the top 10 minor and traces that people should really be concerned about, pay the most attention to, what would that list include?
I would say it would be iodine, iron, zinc, vanadium, selenium, cobalt, chromium, manganese, copper, and phosphorus. Not in any particular order. There are probably some there that are more important than others, but that would be on my list. An interesting alternate notable, which I don't really know yet, it's still an area of investigation for us, is fluoride. It's a dangerous element, in excess, but there's some growing evidence that there's actually some benefit to it as well. But the verdict's out on that one yet. And I definitely would not encourage anybody to experience with that unless you really experiment with that. Unless you really know what you're doing and you're being very careful with it.
You mentioned iron, so a lot of times this will show up on ICP tests as 0, and even after people dose it. I mean, I dose it, and I've had 0 come up on my ICP test. Does it make sense to keep dosing iron if the corals are going to just keep consuming it so quickly?
Sure. So iron and manganese actually don't stay in solution very well in seawater. Both of them are very active elements. They tend to bind easily, both organically and inorganically. So most of the reason behind why it disappears so quickly is because it precipitates out into non-soluble solids. So that said, the best way to maintain levels of iron and manganese in your system is to dose them continuously, throughout a 24-hour period. So once an hour, if you set up a doser or a program to distribute your total daily dose into 24 doses, works well. And you'll start to see readings appear at the same dosage that you wouldn't see them if you did it just once a day, because essentially you're counteracting that precipitation. If you put it in once a day, it's going to precipitate out in a few hours, and your coral are not going to get the full benefit of it. If you do it hourly throughout the day, you'll maintain a level in solution that at least your microbes and coral can.
Now you got me thinking, man. I'll have to maybe use one of my dosing channels for iron. I did not realize that it's got to be constantly dosed throughout the day. That's a pretty interesting observation. What about potassium? I don't think you mentioned potassium as one of those that people should be looking out for. Is that something that? Go ahead.
That's a macro. It's a macro element. That's why I didn't mention it. So I gave you all minors and traces there, but potassium is really a macro element because of the quantity. All of the macros are really important. So there isn't any there. I mean, potassium is very important. Obviously, sulfur is probably one that I don't hear people talk about much, and it really is something you should monitor because a lot of the additives, the salts that we tend to use, particularly for the macro elements, can be in two forms. They can be in chloride-based salts, or they can be in sulfate-based salts. And if you're not using a additive that balances those properly, you can end up with an excess of sulfates, or in some cases I've seen systems with a deficiency in sulfate, and we definitely have observed detrimental effects from that. It affects the ionic balance of the system of the water, and we suspect it probably interferes with either microbial or coral activity and being able to assimilate some of the traces, because those chlorides and sulfates affect the ability to extract the amount of energy involved in extracting those elements out of the water column. And that's based not on biological research, but if you're working with resins and you're trying to remove metals from water samples using resins, the presence of chlorine or sulfate in the water actually interferes with the resin's ability to remove those elements. And resins essentially work off of an energy principle, so they have an amount of energy that they can expend to extract those elements. So we believe that if a resin experiences some change in its ability to extract elements, that probably bacteria and coral do as well, also based on the ratios of chlorides to sulfates.
All right, so Chris at ACI has made a comment, and I want to just pop back to what we were just talking about with iron and dosing that constantly versus just one time a day. Chris' comment is dosing is the key. Manually works, but 24/7 dosing on all the M&Ts, I think he's talking about minors and traces, has been amazing. So that's basically what Chris is saying, is that instead of just hand dosing it at one certain point of the day, to be doing that 24/7. I mean, every like hour, is that kind of like the recommended interval? I mean, what would, if you were making a recommendation in terms of going 24/7 dosing versus once a day, how often, and any particular times of the day? I've heard that, and sorry, this is like I'm making a lot of I'm throwing a lot out there to you, but what I've heard is that in terms of traces, from Chris at Captivate, it's better to do it during the daytime, because I think that's when the corals might be more actively feeding.
Yeah, that's a good question. As far as that particularity, I don't have any experience or data to draw off of. He probably would know better about that. But as far as frequency, I have gone to as frequent as hourly and seen improvements versus doing it 6 times a day or 4 times a day. I know at ACI, I mean, every time I go there, I think, wow, Chris's coral can't possibly look any better. And then he makes one of these changes and they look better. So, I would say, the more frequent you can, the better. I don't think as long as you're, not risking the accuracy of your dosing amounts, I would say the more frequently you can do it, the better. You're not going to experience any negative from it.
Gotcha. And I guess the other logistical thing to consider, and maybe this is not a question for you, but if you're dosing, let's say 7 or 8 different minors or traces, and you don't have enough dosing heads to do that, how do you dose all of them at once on a consistent basis? I think I saw a comment by Chris, or I heard something that Chris said you could actually mix all the traces and minors into RODI water and dose it that way.
Yes, you can. You definitely want to start with a full volume of, you start with 1 liter of water or something like that. You don't want those trace elements additives to combine in concentrated form, because they can precipitate out in non-soluble solids that won't redissolve in the water. But yes, that's absolutely viable. That works. I know Chris does that. I do it. It saves you a lot of time, and it's more work. If you can get it to work with MT and then just fill in the gaps, with a few others, that's obviously the less stressful path. But if you're up to the challenge, then absolutely, that's a totally viable way of doing it.
Switching gears a little bit, talk to us about salinity. Natural seawater is at 35 parts per thousand, and so how do the different salinity levels impact ICP test results? Should we be targeting the 35 ppt?
I personally believe yes. I like to be 35 to 36, and my personal experience, not only with my own systems, but with other systems that I've had the opportunity to observe. They seem to be healthier from that standpoint. The main thing to consider is that the more dilute your water is, the lower your salinity. That's going to lower all of them. The majors, minors, and traces are going to be less. And concentration is a big factor on how available those elements are to either bacteria or to coral. The higher the concentration, the less energy they're going to have to expend to be able to bring those elements in. So that's something to consider. You're making those elements less available to to the system as a whole if you reduce salinity. And likewise, if you are focusing on traces and getting those up to normal levels, but your salinity is low, then that means you've got deficiencies in probably your major elements, either in sodium or chloride or potentially in some of the others. But and that's also something to consider, that may have its own consequences. So yeah, my recommendation is always try to stay 35 and 36.
Gotcha. All right, Gene, I think we're going to get close to wrapping this up. What does the future hold for you guys? Where do you want to see you folks be in a few years at this point?
Well, we, like I said, we got into this out of a passion for the hobby and a desire to help people achieve really their goals and their dreams in the hobby. And I mean, it's I'm sure everybody would agree it's a fascinating and really, it can be a really rewarding hobby to be in. And I think everybody dreams to have incredible growth and fantastic coloration and lots of diversity in their tanks. We really want to be facilitate that, right? And that means listening to what our customers are asking for, understanding what they're doing with the tests, how they're using them. So we're really looking to evolve our products and how we present the information and what products we offer based on the feedback we get from our customers. That's what's going to help us achieve the goal of helping them. So we really want to become more active with the community. We love hearing from our customers. We love getting feedback. We love knowing how they're using the results and what they're experiencing, or if they're running into difficulties. So I really think I see us evolving, in a direction that is obviously towards quality and obviously towards being, assistance to the community. But also, I think it's going to partially be determined by how our customers use the product, what they run into, what they're having trouble with. So we're looking forward to seeing how that surfaces, because it's a bit of an unknown, and it kind of keeps it interesting for us too, and keeps it exciting knowing that there's a bit of an unknown to it. But overall, we really want to support the hobby. We want to support the industry. We want people to be successful. We want everyone to have a gorgeous, beautiful tank that that meets their dreams, and we want to see the industry grow and thrive.
Cool, man. Well, listen, Gene, it was great having you on. I know Paul, the moderator, just put up the link to the website there, so if folks want to interested in picking up some of these kits, they can go visit that link. And yeah. So listen, I really appreciate you taking the time there, Gene, to talk to us about Reef Labs and what you guys are all about, and thanks for answering all my questions and all the viewers' questions. I know there's been a lot of questions in the chat. So yeah, folks, I think if you have any more questions for Gene, probably just follow a link in the website to get a hold of him. And Rob, upstate New York, thank you very much, man, for the super chat. Great chat. $1 towards a keyboard. Yeah. I think it's bad when you can't read some of the letters on the keyboard. It's kind of hard to see there, but I think the A is actually the actual A is gone on the keyboard. So yeah, probably is time to buy a new keyboard.
Well, Keith, thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity to answer the questions and help people get to know us better. So really appreciate it. Thank you.
Cool, thanks. So yeah, again, thanks, Gene. I also want to thank both Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine for sponsoring the live stream and supporting the show. I also want to thank all you folks out there for tuning in and the super chats. Thank you very much. Another big thank you to Paul, the moderator. Also want to let you know that all episodes of Rappin With ReefBum are available as podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Amazon. My next Rappin with ReefBum live stream will be on Thursday, September 29th at 5 p.m. This is 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, not 7 p.m. because I got a guest who's on the other side of the world, Wesley WYSIWYG. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. He was featured on Reef to Reef as a Tank of the Month. So really cool reef, and should be another great show. If you want to check out the full upcoming schedule of guests on reefbum.com, go to the YouTube section. Until then, be safe out there, and we'll see you next time.